The USS Yorktown sank in 1942, and for more than 8 decades, most people thought her story was over.
Steel shrapnel flying everywhere. The mainmast gets hit and it topples down on top of the ship and falls overboard.
A battered carrier, a brutal fight to save it, and a final hit that sent her under.
Look at that. Oh yeah. Oh wow. Oh yeah, that's her.
But when a deep-sea drone finally reached her resting place, the footage showed things nobody expected to survive. Evidence that now forces historians to rethink everything about her last hours. The carrier the Navy bet everything on. Yorktown was born out of a long stretch of trial and error. In the years after the First World War, the United States Navy tried out carriers one by one. First came Langley, which was really an old coal ship with a flat deck on top. Then came the big converted battlecruisers Lexington and Saratoga, fast but heavy, and not built as carriers from the start. Then came Ranger, the first purpose-built carrier, which taught the Navy that a small ship with a small flight deck was too cramped for the kind of air groups they wanted. War games at the Naval War College, plus real sea trials with these early ships, all pushed the Navy toward the same idea. Big, fast carriers that could carry a large air group and still take damage without dying right away. Yorktown was the first of that new line. She was the lead ship of a 3-carrier class built at Newport News, Virginia. The ship's hull ran a little over 820 feet from bow to stern and a little over 109 feet across at the widest point. Fully loaded, she displaced around 25,000 long tons. 4 steam turbines, fed by 9 boilers, could drive her to about 37 miles per hour, fast enough to launch planes, recover them, and still dodge torpedoes and bombs. Her hangar and flight deck were served by 3 big elevators that lifted planes between decks. In peacetime, she carried around 90 aircraft and a crew of a little more than 2,200 officers and men. Inside, she was built to stay alive when hit. The hull was divided into many small compartments, so a blast or a flood in one space would be boxed in by steel walls and doors. Fuel tanks sat in protected layers deep in the ship. Pumps were spread around the hull so that if one section flooded, other pumps could still move water out. Yorktown also carried an early radar set that could spot incoming aircraft beyond the horizon, and she used carbon dioxide to flood parts of the aviation fuel system so that gasoline vapors would not turn a small leak into a ship-killing fire. All of this was meant to buy time in battle. Yorktown was launched in the spring of the mid-1930s with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt as her sponsor, a clear sign that this new type of ship mattered at the highest levels. After workers finished her and she completed her first test trips, she began service in the Atlantic. Before the United States entered the Second World War, she spent long days on neutrality patrols, running routes from Newfoundland down toward Bermuda and the Caribbean. Her job was to watch sea lanes, shadow suspicious ships, and show the flag while the country tried to stay out of open war. That changed overnight after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Yorktown was in Norfolk when the battleships were hit in Hawaii. Within days, she was ordered to the Pacific. She sailed through the Panama Canal, reached San Diego, and soon became the flagship of Task Force 17. From that point on, she was no longer a test bed. She was one of only a few big decks the United States had left to hit back. In the first months of 1942, Yorktown turned into a raid ship. In February, she joined strikes on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, hitting Japanese bases like Jaluit, Makin, and Mili. The goal was not to seize territory, but to shake enemy confidence, sink ships, and force Japan to spread out its forces. A few weeks later, in early March, she teamed up with Lexington for one of the most daring moves of the early war. Planes from both carriers flew over the high spine of New Guinea to attack Japanese shipping and airfields at Lae and Salamaua on the far side of the island. By the time Japan moved toward the South Pacific, Yorktown was already a proven combat ship. The next crisis came at the Coral Sea. Japanese planners wanted Port Moresby on the south coast of New Guinea, so they could threaten northern Australia and choke off supply routes. To stop that move, the United States sent Yorktown and Lexington to form the core of a task force that would meet the Japanese at sea. In early May of 1942, Yorktown's air group helped write a famous line in naval history. Dive bombers from her decks, along with planes from Lexington, found the small carrier Shoho and destroyed it. One pilot radioed back the now famous line, "Scratch one flat top," as the Japanese ship went down. The next day, planes from Yorktown and Lexington fought the bigger carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. Shokaku took heavy damage to her flight deck and had to pull back. Zuikaku's planes were hit so hard that she was no longer able to fight. The Japanese push toward Port Moresby was called off. On paper, the battle looked like a strategic win, but the cost for Yorktown was far higher than the numbers suggested. During the attacks, a single armor-piercing bomb of about 550 pounds hit Yorktown's flight deck about 15 feet in from the island's structure and drove down roughly 50 feet before exploding above the forward engine room. The blast destroyed 6 compartments, knocked out lighting on 3 decks, and bent more than 20 major hull frames. Near misses from other bombs split open seams in her hull between key frames, ruptured fuel tanks, and sent a long rainbow-colored oil slick stretching about 10 miles behind her as she pulled away from the battle. She also lost her radar and part of her cooling systems. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who was on board, estimated that full repairs in a Navy yard would take about 90 days. On the long run back to Pearl Harbor, the ship's own damage control teams did what they could. They patched the hole in the flight deck so cleanly that from above it looked almost untouched. They kept one boiler running so there was still enough steam for basic systems, and they forced the battered hull to hold a steady speed of about 20 miles per hour despite the leaks. Even so, everyone expected that the ship was headed for a long stay in dry dock, maybe even for months, while other carriers carried the fight. While Yorktown was still at sea, intelligence officers in Hawaii were seeing something very different in Japanese radio traffic. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his code-breaking team had cracked key parts of the Japanese naval code. They kept spotting references to a target called AF. To confirm what it meant, they tried a simple trick. Midway Atoll was told to send an open radio message saying it was short on fresh water. Soon after, Japanese messages reported that AF was short of water. That was the proof. Midway was the next major target, and the attack would come in early June of 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz now had a brutal math problem. On the American side, he had Enterprise and Hornet ready to fight. Saratoga was still out of action after a submarine attack months earlier. Lexington was gone, sunk at Coral Sea. On the Japanese side, the main carrier force would bring 4 big fleet carriers that had already hit Pearl Harbor. Without Yorktown, the United States would sail into the Midway fight with only 2 decks against 4. Nimitz decided he did not have that option. He needed Yorktown, even if she was far from perfect. Yorktown reached Pearl Harbor a day earlier than first planned and eased into dry dock number 1 on May 27th. Water was still ankle-deep around her hull as inspectors in rubber boots walked along her side. Nimitz himself went down into the dock to look at the damage. He saw the long stretch of open seams where near misses had pounded the steel. He saw the twisted frames and the strain in the hull. Then he turned to the yard officers and said that they had to have the ship ready in 3 days. There was a long pause. Finally, a hull repair specialist, Lieutenant Commander H.J. Fingstag, swallowed and said, "Yes, sir." What followed was less a normal repair job and more an emergency surgery on steel. Within minutes, wave after wave of shipyard workers poured into the dock and up the gangways. In total, around 1,400 men were assigned. They worked around the clock in 3 straight shifts. To feed the welding machines and lights, the Navy even arranged rolling blackouts in Honolulu so that more power could be pushed to the yard. Instead of carefully fixing each opened seam one by one, crews welded a huge steel plate over the worst section of the hull to seal many leaks at once. Other teams worked in the boiler rooms and engine spaces, fixing only what was needed to get the ship moving at battle speed again. Some of the worst damaged boiler units and deeper machinery stayed offline. Those spaces would have needed weeks of work. There simply was no time. When the job was done, Yorktown could not quite reach her original top speed, but she could still make more than the 20 miles per hour she had held after Coral Sea, enough to keep up with the task force and launch planes into the wind. While welders and pipe fitters fought the clock, staff officers rebuilt Yorktown's air group. At Coral Sea, she had lost many planes and crews. Saratoga, another large carrier, was in a West Coast yard for repairs after being torpedoed earlier in the year, but her squadrons were still available. The Navy did something the Japanese would not do at that point in the war. It moved 3 of Saratoga's squadrons onto Yorktown to replace her losses, mixing the 2 air groups into one composite team so that every parking spot on the flight deck and in the hangar would be filled when she sailed. On May 30th, just 3 days after she entered dry dock, Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor again. Her hull carried fresh scars and big welded plates. Her crew was a blend of veterans and new arrivals. Her engines were not in perfect shape, but she was afloat, she was armed, and she had a full load of planes. Japanese commanders still believed Yorktown was either sunk or out of the war for months. Instead, she was on her way to stand in their path off a small atoll called Midway, with rushed repairs in her bones that would be tested harder than anyone on the dock could yet imagine. Inside Yorktown's last fight. Yorktown woke up on June 4, 1942, already in danger. Out on the open Pacific near Midway Atoll, 2 American carrier groups were spread out over hundreds of miles of ocean. One group, called Task Force 16, centered on the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. The other group, Task Force 17, formed around Yorktown, with Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher using her as his floating headquarters. Coming toward them from the northwest were 4 Japanese carriers that had hit Pearl Harbor only 6 months earlier: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Both sides knew that whoever lost their carriers here could lose the whole Pacific War. Just after dawn, planes based on Midway made the first attacks. They went out with torpedoes and bombs, headed straight for the Japanese force, and were torn apart by defending fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Almost none of them scored hits. Any real damage to the Japanese fleet that morning would have to come from the 3 American carriers. Fletcher kept his ship turning into the wind, cycling scout planes and patrol fighters, looking for the one chance to hit back at the right time. Late in the morning, that chance came. A scout from Yorktown finally found one of the Japanese carriers, Soryu. Yorktown began getting her own strike group ready. Her dive bombers, the Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft from Bombing Squadron 3, lined up on the deck with their large centerline bomb racks filled. Her slow torpedo planes, the TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 3, prepared to skim in low over the water. When Yorktown's strike reached Soryu around midday, the Devastators again took heavy losses, but the dive bombers came in from high altitude with almost no opposition. Pilots rolled their Dauntlesses over and dove straight down at the crowded Japanese deck. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit Soryu. They punched through her flight deck and exploded among fueled planes and stacked weapons. Fires spread so quickly that the crew could not control them. Within minutes, Soryu was a burning wreck, dead in the water and doomed to sink. At nearly the same time, groups from Enterprise hit Akagi and Kaga. In only a few minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were out of the fight. Hiryu was the only one still operating. Hiryu now had a single clear target: Yorktown. Her commander launched a first strike made up of about 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers with a small escort of fighters. As the strike from Hiryu moved in, Yorktown's early radar set picked them up more than 20 miles away. The carrier's fighter director sent up her combat air patrol, a ring of fighters that circled overhead to intercept threats. Those fighters, along with guns from Yorktown and her escorts, shot down several attackers, but not all of them. 3 bombs still got through. One hit the flight deck just behind the forward elevator and blew a hole about 12 feet wide. Metal fragments killed and wounded gunners at nearby anti-aircraft mounts and set planes burning in the hangar below. A second bomb came in from the side, punched through the deck, and exploded inside the ship's funnel system, the large exhaust trunk for her boilers. That down-the-stack hit smashed the exhaust paths, put out fires in several boilers, and knocked out a big part of her power. A third bomb exploded deep inside the ship, starting a stubborn fire near a rag storage room and dangerously close to aviation gasoline tanks and ammunition magazines. For a moment, Yorktown slowed almost to a stop with black smoke pouring from her funnel. Many crews would have given up at that point. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, and his damage control teams did not. The sailors flooded the gasoline lines with carbon dioxide to choke off vapors, turned on hangar sprinklers, dragged hoses through choking smoke, and slammed shut hatches to seal off damaged spaces. In the boiler rooms that were still working, men stayed at their posts in heavy heat and fumes to keep at least some steam pressure going for the ship's basic systems. Within about an hour, the fires were under control. Steam slowly came back, and Yorktown could make about 20 knots again, fast enough to stay with the task force and to launch and recover planes. From a distance, she even looked fairly healthy. The deck crew patched the bomb damage quickly, covering the holes with steel plates and wood so returning pilots could not see where the bombs had hit. Japanese pilots from Hiryu, flying back over the area, saw a damaged carrier throwing out smoke and later saw a carrier still moving. Many of them thought they were looking at two different American ships. Hiryu now struck again. Her second wave was made up of about 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, each carrying a torpedo under the belly. The Japanese pilots came at Yorktown from both sides at once. That meant if she turned to dodge the torpedoes on one side, she would move straight into the torpedoes coming from the other side. Captain Buckmaster tried anyway. He threw the ship into hard turns, tipping her over as the helmsman tried to point the bow into the incoming trails in the water. The idea was simple. If the ship faced the torpedo head-on, it was harder for the weapon to hit the side of the hull. The escorts around Yorktown fired everything they had, filling the air and water with gunfire and splashes. They shot down several of the attacking planes, but not enough to stop the attack. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's left side, less than a minute apart. They hit near the middle of the ship, below the waterline. The blasts ripped open large underwater sections and flooded the boiler and generator rooms. The shock also jammed the rudder. Yorktown began to slow down and lean hard to the left. Inside, men were knocked off their feet. Water rushed into the ship faster than anyone could stop it. All steam pressure died, and the big engines that turned the propellers shut down. For a moment, there was hope. The emergency diesel generator in the back of the ship started and took over the electrical load, but the main circuit breakers snapped open and would not stay closed. Damaged wiring caused short circuits, so every time the generator tried to send power through the ship, the safety system shut it down. With no electricity, the pumps could not run. Without pumps, the rising water could not be slowed. The tilt to the left passed 20 degrees. The central station, deep inside the ship, reported there was no way to correct it with the power they had left. Buckmaster now faced the kind of choice every captain fears. Hundreds of men were still below decks trying to stop the flooding. Many others stood crowded on the open decks. As the tilt pushed past about 25 degrees and kept growing, there was a real chance Yorktown could suddenly roll over. If that happened, the men deep inside would never escape, and men on deck would be thrown into oily, debris-filled water. Buckmaster and his damage control officer reached the same conclusion. Late in the afternoon, he gave the order no one wanted to hear: abandon ship. Even then, the crew did not panic. Sailors went down ladders, crossed the tilted deck, and climbed over the side in long lines. Rope nets and cargo slings hung from the edge of the flight deck to help them down. Nearby destroyers and cruisers backed in as close as they safely could and pulled men aboard by the dozens. One destroyer, USS Anderson, took more than 200 men out of the water. Buckmaster stayed until the end, walking through the ship one last time to make sure no one alive was still inside, then climbing down into the sea himself. By early evening, Yorktown lay alone, badly damaged, smoking, leaning, but still afloat. Night fell, and something unexpected happened. Yorktown did not roll over or sink. Through the dark hours, she drifted on the surface, wounded but still alive. By the morning of June 5th, observers on the rescue ships saw that her tilt had not gotten much worse. A patrol plane even reported that she was still floating. That was enough for Fletcher and Buckmaster. If the ship was trying to survive, they were going to try to save her. The next day, a volunteer team went back aboard. Roughly 30 officers and well over 100 enlisted men formed the salvage party. The fleet tug Vireo began towing Yorktown at a slow pace. The destroyer Hammond tied up alongside her, providing power, water, and extra pumps through heavy hoses and cables stretched between the two ships. The job was to keep the carrier from rolling over and keep her afloat long enough to reach safer waters. Salvage teams pushed unused planes and even some anti-aircraft guns over the side to remove weight from the high side. They also began counter-flooding compartments on the starboard side, carefully letting water into spaces on the opposite side of the ship to balance the flooding on the port side. Hammond's pumps and fire hoses helped put out a fire still smoldering deep inside the hull. Slowly, the list came down. Men who had believed Yorktown was beyond saving began to think they might actually pull it off. But the Japanese had not forgotten her. Submarine 1168 had been sent to the Midway area during the battle. Guided by earlier seaplane reports and careful periscope views, her captain slipped through the American escorts on the afternoon of June 6th. He aimed at the mass of Yorktown and Hammond together and fired 4 torpedoes. One hit Hammond near the middle. The destroyer broke almost in two and sank within minutes. As she went under, her depth charges, barrel-shaped anti-submarine bombs stored on her stern, exploded in a series of violent underwater blasts that killed and wounded many of her own men in the water. Roughly 81 of Hammond's crew of about 241 died. 2 other torpedoes smashed into Yorktown on her starboard side, opposite the earlier torpedo damage. These new hits flooded fresh spaces in a hull already torn open on the port side. The shock knocked salvage crews off their feet, opened new seams, and ruined much of the careful balancing work they had done all day. With water now pouring in from both sides, the small salvage team could not keep up. The order went out again to abandon ship. Vireo cut the tow line, and escorts moved in to pull survivors from both Yorktown and Hammond out of the water. Even after that, Yorktown did not sink right away. Through the night of June 6th into the early hours of June 7th, she still floated, though lower and with a more pronounced lean to port. Around sunrise, lookouts saw the list start to climb quickly. There were no more pumps, no more tugs alongside, and no one left on board to fight the sea. A little before sunrise, she rolled slowly onto her port side, showed the great underwater tear in her starboard bilge, and then slid stern first under the surface in water more than 3 miles deep. Her battle flag was still flying at the masthead as she went under. Later counts estimated that about 141 officers and men from Yorktown's crew died in the battle and sinking, along with the dozens of sailors lost from Hammond. Engineers and investigators in the 1940s could only work from memory, sketches, and external photos. The real clues to how the water moved, how the wiring failed, and what the crew was doing in those last minutes stayed far below them, on a battered hull resting nearly 3 miles down in the dark. That silent ship would hold on to those answers for more than half a century, until new eyes finally reached her. The secrets found on the ocean floor. Far northwest of Midway, the Pacific looks calm and ordinary. Nothing on the surface hints that a little more than 3 miles straight down, an American aircraft carrier is parked on the seafloor. Yorktown lies there on a flat plain of mud, in water so deep that no human diver can reach it. The water is close to freezing, the pressure is hundreds of times higher than at the surface, and there is no sunlight at all. For decades after she sank, nobody saw her again. That started to change in the late 1990s. Ocean explorer Robert Ballard, working with the United States Navy and National Geographic, set out to find the Midway wrecks. His team used sonar to sweep the seafloor northwest of the atoll and picked up a large, flat target. They lowered a remotely operated vehicle, a robot on a cable with lights and cameras, to check it. In May of 1998, its beams cut through the darkness and lit up a long flight deck and a familiar island rising from one side. Yorktown had been found. The sight surprised almost everyone. The ship was upright, leaning to starboard, but still in one piece. The island's superstructure was clearly recognizable, and the flight deck ran forward in front of it. Patches of paint and deck fittings were still visible after more than 50 years. But deep-sea technology was limited. At more than 16,000 feet down, every minute on the bottom strained the robot and its cable. Ballard's team could circle the hull and island and fix the ship's position, but they could not safely push into the hangar or down the elevator wells, so the interior stayed dark. For the next 25 years, that outside view was all anyone had. Meanwhile, underwater robots kept getting better. Thrusters became more precise, cameras sharper, and fiber optic cables could carry live high-definition video from the bottom to the ship. By the early 2020s, it was finally realistic to plan long, careful surveys at depths that once allowed only a few quick passes. In September of 2023, the exploration ship Nautilus arrived over the Midway battlefield, run by the Ocean Exploration Trust with NOAA and Navy support. From her deck, a robot named Atalanta dropped to more than 16,600 feet and spent many hours at depth. Around Yorktown, it flew slow, overlapping paths, filming the hull, the island, and the rows of anti-aircraft gun tubs along the deck edge. Many barrels still pointed up into the water, frozen where they had last been aimed. On one pass, the cameras looked through an opening into the hangar and caught what looked very much like the edge of an aircraft wing. But this mission was focused on outside mapping, so that question had to wait. The answer came 2 years later. In April of 2025, the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer returned to Yorktown on a mission called Beyond the Blue, working in the remote northwestern section of Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. This time, the main robot was Deep Discoverer, a heavy vehicle designed for extreme depths. It could hover almost motionless, ease through narrow openings, and send back high-definition video in real time. Under agreements with the Navy, the work was strictly non-intrusive. Deep Discoverer would only look and record. Nothing would be taken from the wreck. After a long descent through pitch-black water, Deep Discoverer reached the bottom and headed for a large rectangular opening in Yorktown's side, one of the aircraft elevator shafts. In service, that shaft had carried planes between the hangar and the flight deck. Now it was a doorway into the middle of the ship. As the robot slid down along the shaft wall, its lights picked up something nobody expected to see so clearly. A huge world map painted across the steel, roughly 42 feet long and about 12 feet high, titled A Chart of the Cruises of the USS Yorktown, with colored lines tracing her routes before and during the war. Sailors had known that such a mural once existed because pieces of it appear in old black and white photos taken aboard the ship. For more than 80 years, though, nobody had seen the full painting or even known if it survived the sinking. Once the mural was fully recorded, Deep Discoverer eased out of the shaft and into the hangar itself. The pilots moved slowly, watching cables and clearances because a snag at that depth would end the dive. Bit by bit, the cameras pushed past beams and loose structure and into the open hangar space. On the deck below, they finally saw what earlier missions had only guessed were there. Resting in place were at least 3 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers. One of the Dauntlesses lay upside down, its landing gear pointing up and its wings bent but clearly shaped. Under its belly, still locked into a cradle, was a bomb that had never been dropped. Another Dauntless showed faint but readable markings, a letter B and the number 5 on the fuselage, and another large 5 on the upper surface of the wing. Aviation records link that code to Bureau number 4581, a Dauntless from Bombing Squadron 6 on the carrier Enterprise that had landed on Yorktown during the battle. Until then, Midway aircraft were mostly known from old photos and a few museum pieces. Then the cameras picked up something nobody expected at all. Among scattered debris in the hangar sat a four-door station wagon with wood panel sides, a boxy body, and a spare tire on the back. Scraps of chrome still traced the lines of the bumper and grille. Even under silt and marine growth, experts could see features of a 1940 or 1941 Ford Super Deluxe Woody station wagon. Cars like this were often used by the Navy as staff vehicles at bases and ports. A likely idea is that this one served the task force commander or Yorktown's captain, and simply traveled with the ship for use whenever they reached land. But no record has yet tied a specific vehicle to the wreck. NOAA has even asked automobile historians and the public to study the images. For now, the wood-sided station wagon remains one of the strangest mysteries on the site. Deep Discoverer also spent long stretches drifting along the outside of the wreck, filming scars and surroundings in sharp detail. Cameras showed craters punched into the flight deck and areas around the elevator openings where structure had collapsed inward. Along the hull, plates were bent and pushed in where torpedoes had hit, and many anti-aircraft gun mounts were still bolted in place with barrels fixed in their last firing angles. All of this sits in deep water that is cold, dark, and low in oxygen, conditions that studies show slow corrosion compared with warmer, shallower seas. That helps explain why paint still clings to bulkheads, why the mural still shows clear colors, and why the chrome on the station wagon still reflects the robot's lights, even as rust growths, fine sediment, tube worms, anemones, and a bright red jellyfish slowly turn the wreck into part of the deep-sea ecosystem. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.